Have you ever wondered whatever happened to the Celtic tribes the Romans encountered when they invaded Britain thousands of years ago? And what about the legends of King Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table? Were they actually real people or just some medieval folk story? And speaking of fantasy, what's up with all those Britons in fantasy movies and games? Why do they like magic and dragons so much? And lastly, but most importantly for the purposes of this video, why do Cornish and Welsh use so many Y's and W's in their writing all the time? And what do all of these things have in common anyway? Greetings to all, and in this video, we'll be discussing all of these topics, plus my proposition for a unified spelling reform for the real-life languages of the Britons, who, unlike their fantasy and folk counterparts, are very much real people. On the menu today, we'll do a quick overview of the Britons' history and culture, some basic background information, then we'll discuss why a spelling reform for these languages is necessary in the first place. Then we'll finally go over the details of the spelling reform and end with some examples of the new orthography in action. We have a lot to go through, so let's get started. Part 1. History and Background. You often hear people from the modern UK refer to themselves as Britons or Brits, a fitting name for the inhabitants of the island of Great Britain. Yet in the past, this term used to have a much narrower definition. Historically speaking, a Briton refers to those who identified themselves with one of the Brythonic languages, a small language family found clinging to the western fringes of Britain and France. Today, this group includes the modern varieties of Breton, Cornish, and Welsh, and also the extinct Cumbric language from northern England, and possibly the ancient Pictish language from the modern Scottish lowlands. Together with their Gaelic neighbours in Ireland and Scotland, these form the larger modern Celtic family of languages. And though they are mostly limited to the British Isles and northwestern France today, the Celts once used to occupy a much larger area throughout Europe, and were the native inhabitants of Britain and Ireland long before the arrival of the English people. Today, however, much of the Celtic family has sadly gone extinct, with some languages being erased from history so thoroughly that often only short inscriptions remain, if even that. But the Celts are not alone in this world, however, and form part of the much larger Indo-European macro-family, being distantly related not only to most other European languages, but also the likes of Persian and Hindi. But this then begs the question, if the Celts were once so widespread in ancient Europe, how did they get pushed back nearly to the brink of extinction, being relegated to the outer fringes of the continent? Well, the passage of time has not been kind to the Celtic peoples and their descendants. Over the course of millennia, they have endured countless invasions and mass migrations, which eventually turned a once widespread people into a culture clinging on for dear life. The reasons for this decline are complex and multifaceted, spanning several millennia and many different people groups. But in the case of Britain specifically, and as with many things in world history, we can look for an answer in their immediate neighbors to the east, the English. By the end of the 4th century AD, the mighty Roman Empire was in shambles, with provinces breaking off left, right, and center. One of these provinces was Britannia, a region similar in area to modern England, which would break off from the empire around the year 410. The natives of this region were the Britons, and their language was Old Brythonic, the ancestor to modern Breton, Cornish, and Welsh. But after the Romans left, however, the former province broke into pieces. Local kings and rulers, once united by the central Roman government, began to turn on each other in an attempt to fill the sudden power vacuum left by Rome's collapse. This left the once prosperous and well-developed region politically fragmented, and as a consequence, extremely susceptible to raids from their less civilized barbarian neighbors. And sure enough, beginning in the early 5th century, Germanic tribes from mainland Europe began crossing the Channel and joined in the struggle for the future fate of the island. The largest of these barbarian tribes were the Anglo-Saxons, a composite group from northwestern Germany who spoke a curious language known to us as English, or at least a very old version of it. And as these so-called Anglo-Saxons burnt and pillaged the coasts of Britain, it was also during this period that the famed legends of the mighty King Arthur and his knights are said to have allegedly taken place. These tell the tale of a righteous Christian king defending his land and country from the vile pagan invaders. Excalibur, Avalon, Camelot, and Guinevere. These are all names of Brythonic origin. And though the story of Christian kings versus pagan invaders would repeat again centuries later with the now converted Christians, Anglo-Saxons, defending against the pagan Vikings, back in the 5th century, the then still pagan Anglo-Saxons ended up advancing ever deeper into Britannia. Finding the local Britons disorganized and the land fertile for agriculture, they decided to stay, eventually assimilating the native Britons out of the western edges of the island. Some Brythonic groups were so distraught with the Anglo-Saxon invaders that they decided to leave Britain entirely, settling in northwestern coasts of France, which would eventually make them the ancestors to the modern Bretons. This, then, also explains why the contemporary region is called Brittany, meaning in fact Little Britain, as opposed to Great Britain, being the largest island of the modern UK. Another interesting side note is that, in all modern Celtic languages, both Brythonic and Gaelic, the English language and its people are still called Saxons, or some derivative thereof. Further into the Middle Ages, then into more recent times, all Celtic languages began declining in favor of other languages, with English on the Isles and French in Brittany. Pictish was the first one to be rendered extinct in the 1100s, somewhat ironically falling victim to the then newly established Gaelic-speaking Kingdom of Scotland. It was soon followed by the death of its southern neighbour, Cumbric, in the 1200s, with the rise of the Anglo-Saxon Kingdom of Northumbria. By the 1700s, Cornish had gone extinct, and by the late 1900s, Gaelic's Manx also died out. All other Celtic languages, with the notable exception of Welsh, also suffered severe near-terminal declines by modern times, and in many of these areas, use of these languages were even completely outlawed. So, with these things in mind, we can now take a look at the next section, Part 2, Why a Spelling Reform? With many of these languages in various stages of being revived, thanks to preservation efforts, it is important for them to build off of a strong, and most importantly historical, foundation. And that begins with a stable orthography. But, out of all of the Brythonic languages, only one has such a stable foundation: Welsh. Breton and Cornish also have their own orthographies, of course, but they are a mess of different and often contradicting rule sets, with no single agreed-upon standard. But as for Welsh, anyone who has ever even so much as glanced at anything written in the language will most certainly comment on its peculiarity. Which then begs the question, how can we build a solid base for all of these languages to thrive while also preserving their ancient past and rich traditional culture? Let us set a few guidelines for us to build a working, historically accurate, and culturally respectful orthography. The guidelines shall be thus. First, spelling must honor their modern pronunciations while also being general enough for any language or dialect to be able to use without extensive modification. If something works in one dialect of a language but does not work in another of the same language, then it's out. Secondly, spellings must honor traditional Celtic letter usages. This means that using letters or combinations of letters that don't have any true historical Celtic basis or are taken from other language groups like English or French are also out. Examples for this are the modern Breton's use of C''h, ZH, GN, etc., and Welsh's double D and double Fs, which are all relatively recent inventions. Additionally, we have the inconsistent uses of C and K across the board, and I've seen suggested many times the likes of assigning the letter X to the sound ch. Finally, number 3, spellings must also honor the historical spellings and pronunciations of its Old Brythonic ancestor, which unites all modern Brythonic languages together, giving us a solid base to start from. So with that out of the way, we can now move on to Part 3, the proposed reform. So here's the new update to my Unified Brythonic Orthography, available for Breton, Cornish, Cumbric, and Welsh. It contains a 25-letter set of the Latin script, almost no diacritics of any kind, and a handful of assorted letter combinations. First, we'll begin with the alphabet's individual letters, then letter combinations, and finally some special rules for each language. Afterwards, we'll go over some examples with the new system. Let's get started. A. Alarch. B. Bis. C. Cair. D. Diriad. E. Erch. F. Fordd. G. Glyn. H. Hallen. E, also called E dot in Welsh, Isel. J. Giraffe. L. Lawen. M. Mab. N. Nodwith. O. Organ. P. Pedwar. Q. Question. R. Wrath. S. Sach. T. T. U, also known as I bedol in Welsh. Ufern. V. Vaccine. Dove. Whiskey. X. Xenon. Ye. Yar. And finally, ze, zoo. And now for the digraphs and other consonant rules. These will fill out the missing phonemes that the single letters didn't cover, among some other things. First up, we have the plain voiced nasals and labial consonants, which don't get a single letter. We will basically use the nearest combination of single letters that makes sense, and as you can see, things are mostly straightforward. There's the notable exception of qua, which uses the letter Q instead of the expected C, as because, for 98% of the time, qua only appears in loanwords from Latin or English. So, in order to keep the Romance-like style, we will use the Q here instead. For other fricatives and devoiced consonants, the scheme is also similarly straightforward. You basically just take the sound you want to affricate or devoice, then add an H after the letter. But before I actually go through any of these, I do want to mention a few more that might come in handy a little later. These 3 digraphs here, despite their arguably more Gaelic look, are meant to be used for writing Old Brythonic. The sounds these represent don't really occur in modern languages any longer, having shifted to other sounds or being deleted for the most part, though they will still come in use for us as we'll see later on. But just as an example, here we have the reconstructed word for water in Old Brythonic, clearly using the BH digraph in the middle of the word. Usually, this sound either becomes a V or disappears, but its use is clear in this example. Now going back to what I mentioned before, at least with the regards to the DH and the TH, Breton specifically doesn't really have these sounds anymore, being highly influenced in pronunciation by the neighboring French, which doesn't have them either. The problem is, however, that many Breton dialects actually pronounce the outcomes of these sounds completely differently, depending on geographic region. Usually, these sounds are written with either a plain Z or H, or are also occasionally written with an interesting ZH digraph, neither of which are particularly helpful. Interestingly enough, though, the situation is actually somewhat similar to what happened in the Gaelic languages, which also used to have both the DH and TH sounds in the Middle Ages, but have since lost them in a similar manner. As such, we will actually take inspiration from Breton's Gaelic cousins and spell it out in the etymological DH and TH, even though they aren't technically pronounced that way anymore. The benefits to this are not only helping with etymology, but also, and more importantly, in helping out to unite the various Breton dialects, which have different pronunciations for these in different places. As such, the ZH digraph for Breton is henceforth banished to the shadow realm. But another language that has since lost another sound is Cornish. In its case, the rather harsh ch sound, as found in this example, yach, meaning healthy or fine, has since softened up to either a plain H sound, h, or is deleted, depending on its placement in a word. When non-initial, it is usually written with a GH, while when at the beginning, it is usually part of a mutation and is spelt with a single H in agreement with its pronunciation. Now, though I mentioned the GH was to be used for Old Brythonic, we'll make an exception here and keep the H initial, GH everywhere else spelling for Cornish specifically, since both Breton and Welsh actually managed to keep the harsher ch sound as an independent phoneme separate from h, they will still use the ch spelling for it, so they don't have to worry about this either way. Interestingly enough, however, this actually also happened to English when it inherited the Proto-Germanic ch sound, as shown in words like light, laugh, or enough. Moving on to another digraph we'll repurpose from Old Brythonic is the MH. This will have two additional uses. The first use is in Breton again, where, together with the final plain M letter, they will be used to depict nasal vowels. Again, likely due to its nasal sound-loving French neighbor, Breton actually managed to keep the MH sound from Old Brythonic somewhat, together with creating more nasal vowels elsewhere. Currently, it is spelt with an N tilde, which is rather odd considering its main use in Spanish. When paired specifically with a V or W-like sound, the nasal in those cases will be spelt with an MH instead. Should there be no V or W sound near it, however, as shown by this example, a plain M will be used instead, as long as there's no other vowel after it, such as at the end of a word or before another consonant. Otherwise, the MH is used again. Another use for the MH is in the D voice sonorants as found in Welsh. Together with these other ones that you see here, these make the quote-unquote funny sounds, so characteristic to Welsh. For the most part, these are pretty self-explanatory. However, the only thing to note here is that the existing double L digraph will be replaced with the LH as to follow the pattern while also being more historically accurate. Right, now let's move on to something else. Regarding the yod, or the y sound, Whenever it appears initially in all languages, it will always use the letter Y, unlike the current Welsh system, which uses an I instead. And for mostly everything else, the Y will also be used, including the final palatalized L's and N's of Breton as depicted here. The only exception is for the internal iods in Welsh, which will still use an I when immediately after a consonant. This is because Welsh uses the letter Y slightly differently, as we'll see later on, so an I will be retained here instead. And speaking of palatalization, sounds like ch and sh aren't really native to these languages, either being borrowed from the likes of English or French, or as an alternate or allophonic way of pronouncing an S plus a y. Currently, the sh sound is written as sh in Cornish and Welsh, and ch in Breton, with for the latter likely due to French influence. This will be undone, and a simple s plus an I or y will be used instead. So no more using ch or sh for the sound sh. In a similar fashion, the sound j, or in Breton je, is also not native to the Brythonic languages either. Most commonly, however, it appears in Cornish as a regional sound change in certain dialects where the letter D or S changed via an intermediary Z sound. In the standardized form of Cornish, however, this shall be reversed, and a simple S or D will be used in these environments instead. Dialectively, however, a J letter may be used in such scenarios. Another thing in this example specifically, you might notice that only one S is used here instead of the previously used two. This is because the letter Y cannot be long in such a position, even when stressed, so only one S is required. Continuing briefly with Cornish, there is also another regional sound change in certain dialects, which changes the letter T next to an I or Y into a ch sound. Just like the previous S example, the original T will be used in the standard language. Next up are the double consonants. This one's a bit tricky, as with the sole exception of some local Cornish dialects, the geminate consonants from Old Brythonic have effectively merged with their single counterparts in pronunciation. This does not mean, however, that they've become completely irrelevant. In fact, quite the opposite. It all has to do with the modern Brythonic system of syllable stress and vowel length. Usually, whenever a stressed vowel occurs before nasals and liquids, they are generally lengthened. However, if that nasal or liquid used to be doubled, it then becomes short instead. As such, the difference between doubled and single consonants can be used to distinguish between similarly sounding words without the use of any diacritics or other modifiers. Here, we can see an example with a single N and a long vowel, whereas here we can see a similar word with a doubled N and a short vowel in the same position. And just to really drive the point home, here's yet another example with a doubled M. Therefore, in all cases, whenever these four used to show up in Old Brythonic, double M, N, L, and R must be kept in their daughter languages also, since it can help in correct pronunciation and stress determination. I say these four specifically, as while other doubled consonants did exist, only these actually affected the stress system in any meaningful way. A minor side note here is that the Welsh unvoiced L is now written LH, as previously mentioned, so there should be no confusion between it and the newly reintroduced double L. As shown by this example here, the double L is now pronounced the same as the regular single L, and is simply there to show that the previous vowel is pronounced short instead of the normally expected long vowel. Now, a final note for the consonants. There is now a special rule for final obstruent devoicing. This rule shall be implemented in order to standardize the spellings of certain words across languages. Despite the complicated sounding name, the rule itself is quite simple. Basically, whenever a noun or adjectives ends in a k, p, or t sound, if they are a noun, they will be spelled with a final G, B, or D letter instead. Whereas if they are an adjective, they will be spelled with a C, P, or T respectively. That's it. That's the whole rule. So, to give an example, in the phrase Brythonic, Brythonic, even though they both end in a k sound, Brythonic alphabet is a noun, so it will be spelled with a final G letter instead of a C. So that's all for the consonant stuff. Now we'll move on to talking about the vowel system. All in all, it's mostly straightforward, but it does have some minor explaining to do, especially with regards to the Y vowel I mentioned earlier. So let's start with that first. If you've ever seen anything written in either Cornish or Welsh, you might have noticed that, among other things, there seems to be an overabundance of the letter Y. What gives? Well, Old Brythonic had two distinct I-like sounds, the regular E, written with the letter I, and a tensor I, written with the Y, which had originated from an even earlier short I sound. The problem arises, however, in the modern languages, which all ended up modifying this I-Y pair in their own separate ways. In Breton, the Y sound always ended up merging with the E letter, whereas in Cornish, some dialects merge it with the E like in Breton, yet others merge it with an I. As for Welsh, well, Welsh not only merely kept the I-Y distinction, but made it even more complicated by changing its pronunciation depending on syllable placement. Generally speaking, in Welsh the Y is pronounced U or E depending on dialect when it's at the final syllable, and as a schwa, everywhere else. Now get this, should a suffix be added to the end of a word, and the syllable containing a word final Y gets moved back a syllable, the pronunciation of the Y changes accordingly back to a schwa. Astonishing. So, we can't just fully get rid of it, as changing the Y to something else would incur headaches that we really don't need right now. As such, we shall keep the Y spelling in Old Brythonic, Cornish, Welsh, and our surprise guest, Cumbric, while keeping the E letter spelling in Breton. I mean, you could use the Y spelling in Breton to show historical spelling, but it's functionally redundant in Breton, so officially it's just simpler to keep the spelling with an E. One last thing about the letter Y as a vowel is that for languages that are not Welsh, final and unstressed I's are to be written as a Y, as was done traditionally. Welsh, of course, cannot do this due to the pronunciation differences mentioned before, but this is just something to keep in mind. Next up are vowel combinations in the form of digraphs and diphthongs. Again, these are just fancy words for either two letters next to each other or two sounds next to each other. For the digraphs, that is, two letters next to each other, that represent a single sound, these are quite simple since there's only two of them. We'll basically be standardizing on the Breton and Cornish model, which is also something similar to how French deals with these same sounds. Remember how in the alphabet section, the plain U letter was pronounced U or U? Well, the EU will be pronounced as E, and OU will be pronounced OO. But since Welsh and Cumbric don't actually have an E sound in their phonemic inventory, they will instead just use it to represent a plain E plus a plain U next to each other, so it's not actually a digraph. But then you might ask, well, what about all the Welsh diphthongs that have a U sound at the end? Won't it conflict then? Excellent question. Remember how I mentioned that Welsh is going to use the letter Y as a consonant slightly differently? Well, here it is. All the old diphthongs ending in U will be replaced to end in Y instead. The AE, OE, and WI will remain unchanged, however. But since the old EY was already changed to EU, as mentioned before, there's no longer any conflicts between them, and the whole roster now matches up quite nicely. This is also the only place where the W is sort of used as an almost vowel, with every other instance of the old W as a vowel in Welsh being changed to the new OU digraph. So, as you can see here from this lineup, all the kids are mostly playing nicely with each other. Old man Brythonic will be proud. The only downside to this is that it makes Welsh lose similarities with the U diphthong, but you win some and lose some. As for all the others, everything else is pretty straightforward. For the ones ending in U, just add a W, and for the ones ending in E, just add a Y in most cases. Again, except for Welsh, which will add an I instead of the Y for the earlier discussed reasons. One last special diphthong I want to mention is the plural ending O. Regardless of pronunciation, we will standardize it across the board, again with the notable exception of Welsh. Additionally, we will get rid of the old Breton OU with an accent, since this ending being spelt this way doesn't really conflict with anything else. Now we get to the digraphs involving unexpectedly long vowels. As stated earlier, vowel length is usually predictable and based on stress patterns with following consonants. But should a rare long vowel make an appearance, these digraphs should be used instead. Not every language is going to make use of all of these at once, and some of them even cannot, like Welsh's AE already being used for something else, but these are here just in case. Also, one of the few places where the long A needs to be used is in the vocative particle, such as in a phrase like, "Ah, my word," or something like that. So, the usage for these in general are quite rare. This brings the attention to the use of the circumflex diacritic in Welsh. By following these new rules of diphthongs, digraphs, and double consonants, we've actually almost fully gotten rid of the circumflex entirely, with the sole exception of the word with, that still uses a circumflex despite having a short vowel. As such, we'll actually respell all of them as HA for consistency, even if, depending on the speaker, the H might sometimes be silent. Since Welsh insists on keeping the spelling of this word separate anyways, it shouldn't cause too much of an issue. As such, all of the circumflexes in Welsh have now been rendered completely obsolete, with the inclusion of the acute and grave accents as well. Speaking of grave accents, Breton and Cornish also currently use them, so let's get rid of them as well. First on the chopping block is Breton. Since we've already discussed the use of the grave accent in the plural O ending, the only one that's left is in contractions such as this one. Being a contraction of a longer word, we'll just spell it out as a regular contraction with an apostrophe instead of a needless grave accent. Next up are the graves in Cornish. This one's a bit strange, as it has a few different pronunciations depending on context. When depicting a short O-like sound as shown in this example, it shall now be spelt with an O. No reason to use a U or an accent here. Another current use for it is making irregular short vowels vaguely similar as in Welsh. But because of the stress and vowel rules that we discussed before, the grave can be gotten rid of here in this case as well, making sure to use the correct vowel spelling for the vowel it represents. Remember, this word should be pronounced Buddha and not Buddha. Another strange diacritic that Cornish sometimes likes to use rather inconsistently is the diaereses, or the double dots, to show certain dialect-specific pronunciations. Again, as mentioned before, and at risk of sounding like a broken record at this point, the etymological vowels should be written here as well, as this one spelling unifies all dialects, regardless of pronunciation. Lastly, the only remaining diacritic left is the diaereses as used in syllable breaks. Honestly, use of this one is theoretically quite rare, but there can be occasions where you might want to break up a vowel grouping into separate syllables. As such, the use of this is allowed, but its scope is going to be rather limited. Now that we've talked about mostly everything, let's move on to the last part. Part 4. Examples. Time to finally look at this new orthography in action. First up is the classic Article 1 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, since we can find this text in all of these languages. Please feel free to pause the video at your leisure to take a closer look at these examples whenever you want. So let's dive in. First up is Breton. As you can see here, I've given two new variants underneath the old version on top. The first one will be with the Brythonic Y, and the second one will be without it. All languages listed here from now on will be shown with both with and without, simply for the sake of example. But just remember that each language will have a recommended version and another that's just a theoretical and not at all supposed to be actually used. As mentioned earlier, Breton doesn't really make use of the Brythonic Y anymore, so it's recommended to write without it. Other than that, you can clearly see the use of the new DH and TH digraphs, and the much more common use of W's and the replacement of K's with the more Celtic-looking C's. Next up is Cornish, which actually sees the least amount of change out of all of them, with the notable replacement of K's for C's yet again. Because the various dialects of Cornish pronounce the Y's differently as previously mentioned, the Y spelling should be used here, the opposite of its southern sibling Breton. Then we have Welsh, which arguably sees the most change out of all of them. No more double F's or double D's, no more circumflex hats, the funny L sound is spelt in a coherent manner, and the vowel digraphs are spelt closer to their actual pronunciation. Pretty good overall. Last but not least, we have the long extinct Cumbric, which sees a revival in this example. I do want to mention that this is a reconstructed version of the language, as we don't actually have much in the way of historical data for it. But it's nice to have it around for this example regardless. So please, take a look. Now, I did also want to make one for Pictish, but there's even less information on it than the reconstructed Cumbric we saw earlier, so we'll sadly have to forgo it. However, should we uncover more information about it in the future, in all likelihood, if it is indeed a Brythonic language, most things that I've said here for the other languages will also apply for good old Pictish as well. But now back to the land of the living. Here we can see the old versions side-by-side comparison. If you squint hard enough, you can sort of make out that these languages are somehow related, but the relationship is a bit muddied at best. But now, with the new versions, we can much more clearly see their relatedness and familial kinship. Truly inspiring. So the last example we'll be looking at today is their patriotic hymn, Old Land of My Fathers, which has versions in all three living languages. Starting with Breton once more, we can see some nice cleanup in the use of the diacritics and a clear Celticization in the spellings. Next, we have the Cornish version, and again, not much gets changed here with the notable replacement of K's for C's yet again. And last but not least is the Old Welsh version. This one gets quite the heavy rework, so please take some time to review this one more closely. And that's it. That's all I have for you today, and I hope you have enjoyed this video. Remember to like the video if you did, and let me know in the comments down below any ideas you might have. Hopefully, this can spark some constructive discussion, and who knows where that will lead. But either way, thanks so much for watching.